Chapter 10. Peking. When we finally got home, we learned that the State Council had issued a directive announcing the end of the exchange of experiences movement and calling on all Red Guards to return to their original units. When Peng Ming recovered, he went back to Peking, but not everyone was dutiful as he. The more the order was repeated, the more young people feared they would never again have the chance to travel to other places, for under normal circumstances, most couldn't expect to leave their hometowns in their entire lifetimes. There was a last-minute flood of new departures by people hoping to get in on the tail end of the free train rides, and clever ways to get around the new restrictions were invented. Liang and I, for example, walked for 3 days south to Heng and then traded our free tickets back to Changsha for those of a group of agricultural students being sent home to Guangzhou. They're trying to get to Peking, and every bit of progress north was welcome to them. In Guangzhou, we spent Spring Festival at the home of an old colleague of my father's with a pretty little daughter of my age, who took us to eat as many bananas and sticks of sugarcane as we could. Her name was Sha'an, and she danced and sang her way into my 12-year-old heart, weeping when Liang and I decided to give ourselves up at one of the hospitality stations and get free tickets back home again. Later, I would cherish that childish love she had offered me and think of her when I was lonely. This was just a prelude, however, to my big adventure. I had nothing to do because the middle schools were so busy making revolution that they were taking no new students, and traveling had gotten into my blood. My greatest dream was now to go to Peking, where I could be with Peng Ming again. I was lucky. Some new friends from the Peking Machinery Institute agreed to take me back home with them. I pinned my collection of Chairman Mao buttons in display fashion onto a large handkerchief, folding it carefully and putting it onto the pockets of the big beat-up cotton-padded overcoat I had borrowed from father. I wanted to be ready for anything. The trains were even more crowded than they had been on the trip to Guangzhou, and at first we despaired of being able to squeeze on. There were no conductors and no tickets, but the Red Guards already on board refused to unlock the doors. At last, we noticed that one of the washroom windows was slightly open. My bigger friends hoisted me up. I got my hand inside and released the latch. We pushed the window open and I crawled inside. There were 2 Red Guards sleeping by the open hole on the floor that served as a toilet, and they weren't happy to see me when my entrance woke them up. I argued with them a long time before they finally agreed to let my friends climb in. Then the proprietors of the toilet opened the door pointedly and showed us out, locking the door into occupied with a snap. It had been cold outside, but the train was hot. Every conceivable space was claimed, with people even sitting on the tea tables and sleeping on the luggage racks. The only thing we could do was to stand and hope to negotiate for a place with someone getting off. Considering the close quarters, the general mood wasn't bad. There were occasional fights, though, the major one being with the Guangzhou Red Guards, who had barricaded themselves into 4 entire cars at the beginning of the trip and refused to let anyone else in. Finally, their windows were smashed and there was a redistribution of bodies, but in Wuhan, 5 hours to the north, the density was restored again. There was struggle at every station, the people outside wanting to get in and the people inside wanting to keep them out. It was 2 days and 2 nights to Peking. Food soon became a problem, but those with foresight shared with those without. Even worse was the question of relieving oneself, for the bathroom had long been blocked off. The girls developed a system of climbing out onto the platform in groups and encircling each other while they did their businesses in turns. The boys simply went out and used the tracks, for there was no shame in those days. Leaving the train, however, was a dangerous game. There was no guarantee your re-entry would be an easy one. On more than one occasion, I saw someone left behind because he had responded to the call of nature. At Zhengzhou came trouble. The station was full of soldiers checking everyone's identification papers and making those from the south get off. Already, a small angry group was being ushered to one end of the platform, and we could hear chanting and quarrelsome voices from the next car. I was really afraid, for it seemed that all my hopes would be for nothing. Then one of my friends urgently mentioned for me to follow him out the window onto the trackside and walked me along the far side of the train where the soldiers wouldn't see us, all the way back to the last car. It was a signal car, and a worker in an oil-stiff cap was sitting in it, wiping his red and green lantern. "Old master worker," said my friend very politely. "This is my little brother. He's very ill and can't bear the crowd any longer. Won't you let him rest in your car a while?" The worker looked at us suspiciously. "No one is allowed to ride in here," he said. He looked me over, and I tried to seem yawn and sick, which wasn't too difficult. I could see him softening. "Are you from Peking?" he asked. My friend showed him his ID, and I was glad I looked too young to have one. I was glad, too, that my standard Chinese was better than that of most of my classmates. Screwing up my courage, I said in my best approximation of a Peking accent, "If you let me ride with you, I'll show you my Chairman Mao button collection." In those days, there was nothing more coveted and more difficult to get a Chairman Mao button, since few people outside of the Red Guards themselves could make the long journeys to the revolutionary sites where they were distributed. The worker's eyes gleamed with interest, and I pressed my advantage. "I'll give you one. I'll let you choose any one you like." "All right then, come on up and let me see," he said, his duty quickly forgotten in the face of such temptation. "You can stay for a while, but you will have to go back to the next station." I climbed on before he could change his mind, and my friend waved briefly and left. Then I reached deep into my pocket and took out my handkerchief, exposing my treasures to his greedy gaze. His hands were big and greasy, and I sat in horror as he fondled my prizes, my heart jumping as he paused before each jewel, afraid that that would be the one that I have to sacrifice. While I couldn't bear to part with a single one, I could also hear the loudspeaker calling, "All Red Guards without Peking identification cards, please get off immediately." And I was afraid that he might pay attention and make a connection between the announcements and my presence. So I babbled incoherently, trying to distract him, telling him how I had gotten these in Sanwan, those at Pingxiang, and he wavered interminably, hating to lose any of them just as much as I did. Finally, he unclasped one of the Jinggang Mountain buttons, a big red one with Chairman Mao's head floating over these golden peaks. "I'll take this one," he announced. "I already have one in Peking, and now all I need is Shaoshan, Yannan, and Ruijing for the complete set of the 5 major revolutionary shrines." I thought I would die, for I only had 3 from Jinggang Mountain. At the same time, I felt I would have given him the whole handkerchief full if only he wouldn't throw me off the train. So I watched in private agony as he pinned the button onto his blue worker's overcoat, smiling and chatting as if I were his guest for Saturday tea. I was praying for the train to start, but it didn't, and finally the worker hopped off to see what the delay was about. He came back 10 minutes later and said, "Some of the Red Guards wouldn't get off, but the Peking Red Guards helped the PLA to move them. We should be moving along in a minute." Sure enough, the train pulled off, and we passed the group I should have been among. Red Guards from Henan, Hubei, Hunan, and Guangzhou, standing miserably on the platform, waiting to be sent back where they had come from. At the next stop, I thanked the worker and told him I felt better, and went back to join my friends. They greeted me with a round of applause and made room for me in their now spacious car. I fell asleep, and when I woke up, I was in Peking. The loudspeaker was playing "The East is Red," and it was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Peking was cold to my sneakered feet, and the wind was like knives. But to me, it was heaven. The avenues seemed 5 or 6 times as broad as those in Changsha, the buildings cleaner and more splendid, if a bit austere. I immediately demanded to be taken to Tiananmen Square, and tired as they were, my friends took me. Watching with amusement, then I stared at everything that was legend. The Great Hall of the People, the monument to the heroes of the people, the historical museum. Like every other Red Guard coming to Peking for the first time, I took my oath in front of the huge picture of Chairman Mao, lifting my little red book in my right hand, sticking out my chest, and reciting proudly, Chairman Mao, Liang Heng has finally come to your side. I will always be loyal to you. I will always be loyal to your thought. I will always be loyal to your revolutionary line. I could have stayed there all night, but my friends comforted me, saying there would be many other chances. They took me home with them and drew me a map of where to find Peng Ming and the Central Institute of Music, so I could go first thing in the next day, and found me a bed and tucked me in, their little weary traveler. It took me nearly a whole morning to find the Central Institute of Music in the Western District. It was so famous that I'd expected it to be on a grand avenue, but it was behind an old iron gate off a small lane. Still, what I saw when I walked in was more than beautiful enough to satisfy me, for across the road stretched an old rectangular building in the imperial style, with a green tile roof, ornately carved wooden windows, and red pillars. I walked through and found myself facing a second building identical to the first, and saw on the right a smaller one, with a sign, Museum of the History of Musical Instruments, which for some reason was all boarded up. Beyond the second barrier were the gray cement dormitories. I learned that my friend Peng Ming was probably in the broadcast station of his rebel organization, so I went there to look for him. He and his comrades were crowded around a desk on which was spread a group of photographs, and they were discussing them in urgent tones, pointing and passing them around. I stood awkwardly in the doorway for several minutes, afraid to disturb them. I thought Peng Ming looked exhausted and much thinner than before, but still close to magnificent in his Red Guard Army-style uniform and red armband. He finally noticed me, breaking into a huge smile and coming over and grasping my hands tightly in his. You've come just in time. Work in our Red Guard organization and make revolution with us. Then he turned to his friends. Comrades, he announced, this is my old neighbor and the youngest member of my new Long March team. He had come all over the way from Hunan to help us. From that day, everybody knew me as Little Hunan. Peng Ming shared his own narrow bed with me, and every night we squeezed with a pillow at each end, a blanket, and an odd assortment of beat-up coats piled up in a small mountain on top of us. Every morning, he led me in singing The East is Red, and every evening, the Internationale. If he had a few minutes, he instructed me in revolutionary thought, teaching me that we young revolutionaries must be willing to give our blood for the revolution, that we were the dawn of China, and that we must always be vigilant against our own individualism and revisionist tendencies. I admired him more than ever. Although he was so busy, he usually had to ignore me. Sometimes he never came back to sleep at all, or stayed awake in the room all night writing posters and articles. He lived as if there were a war going on, and did everything with bloodshot eyes in an aura of emergency. He let me wander around for a week to get used to the surroundings. The classrooms were all boarded shut, and signs hung on the doors reading, Feudalist Capitalist Revisionist. Pianos had been pulled out into the corridors and sealed shut with the stamps of the Red Guards, and broken desks and chairs lay about everywhere. Sheet music of classical European composers was scattered all over the floors, some of it in charred remnants, and from ceiling to floor, from wall to wall, sometimes more than 10 layers thick, were the words of struggle and criticism. The existing walls weren't enough for all these words, and additional bamboo partitions had been erected all over the grounds of the institute, slicing flower beds into two and blocking alleyways between dormitories. Sometimes the characters were so large I could hardly imagine how they had been written with a brush, sometimes so small I had to bend down to read them. Often, when I went to the bathroom, I would notice two men sweeping the corridors and cleaning out the toilets. One day, another child told me that the old one was Ma Sicong, the president of the institute and a famous violinist, and the youngish one, wearing heavy leather shoes and traditional clothes with cloth buttons, was Liu Shikun, the famous pianist. I had seen enough of this kind of thing by then not to think much about it, but when Peng Ming explained to me that the pictures in the broadcasting room the first day had been of Liu Shikun accepting first prize in an international youth competition in the Soviet Union, I assumed that he must be an unusually bad man. After about a week, Peng Ming told me that I could help the organization. Because I was so young, he asked me to sell their newspaper, The Red Flag of Art, around Wangfujing, Xidan, and Tiananmen Square. I didn't know my way around, so a fat little girl pianist became my guide and special friend. Like most of the other children selling newspapers, she had been something of a child prodigy and a student at the Central Institute of Music's attached middle school. We took turns riding each other to work on the back of a bicycle. She had an unusually piercing voice and could outsell the rest of us hands down. I worked like a madman, sometimes not getting to sleep until 2 or 3 in the morning. Latest of all was probably the evening Peng Ming asked me to help the group hang a cloth slogan on a propaganda wall on Xidan Street. The slogan was nearly 2 stories high, and we had to use 2 ladders fastened together to climb to the top. When we had unrolled and straighted, said in huge gleaming black characters, "Down with Xiao Wangdong, destroy the Ministry of Culture." In this way, I gradually got to know what was going on at the Central Institute of Music. The situation was basically the same as it was all over China, and the rebel groups were deeply involved in factional struggles. The old Protect the Emperor group had been disbanded, but some of its members had formed a rebel group called Mao Zedong Thought Struggle Group, under the famous scholar Guo Moruo's son, Guo Sihong, and it remained a major conservative force. The rebel groups was led by Peng Ming, and it was called the Red Cliff Struggle, after the book about a pre-liberation KMT prison. There was also a new group, which had splintered off from the Red Cliff Struggle group, called the Peking Commune. Each of these groups claimed to be the most revolutionary, and it was always attacking the others in big character posters and broadcasts as protectors of the reactionary capitalist road. These factional struggles were so absorbing that the revolutionaries had little time for anything else. Then one day, a month or so after I had arrived, disaster struck. The Mao Zedong Thought Struggle group plastered up a huge poster announcing the bad news. The Red Cliff Struggle Group has released our institute's stinking capitalist rotor violinist and helped him to escape. Last night, a Japanese radio station reported that Ma Sicong and his family had already left China. This counter-revolutionary incident was planned and effected by the Red Cliff Struggle Organization, which must bear the consequences. I shall never forget the look of incredulity on Peng Ming's face when he read that poster. He looked as if he just had been told that he had forgotten to go to his own father's funeral. Then he shouted for a truck to take the group to Ma Sicong's house to prove that the poster was a lie. I hitched a ride on the back of somebody's bicycle. It was all true. Although none of the belongings had been removed, there wasn't a capitalist rotor in the house. Everything was in great disorder, for there had been many search raids, and the Red Cliff Struggle Red Guards were standing in the middle of the chaos, saying that they had been tricked and that the Mao Zedong Thought Struggle Group must have let him go. Then they hurried back and put up a poster saying, 恶人先告状. Evil people are the first to make accusations. The two groups fought for nearly a month about this, but nobody ever established how the famous violinist got away. One evening, late at night, I was lying in bed watching Peng Ming write posters. He had a brush in one hand, and he was eating 2 steamed yellow sorghum and some pickles with the other. His hair stuck out like fire all around his head, and his frame was like that of a skeleton in glasses. For a long time, I had wondered about why he wanted to drive himself to that condition and screwing up all my courage. I asked, how did you get to be so dedicated and enthusiastic? He stopped writing and looked at me sharply. Then he put down his brush and began to talk with me. I think it was the first time he had seen me as anything more than a child. I want to exercise myself, he said. I want to collect experience. Supporting the great cultural revolution is a great chance for us young people to develop ourselves. I thought to myself that, in a way, that this was what I was doing too, since the struggles in Beijing really had nothing to do with me. And I thought too that I should try to understand more about what was going on around me. Why do you sometimes say that you want to turn the Central Institute of Music inside out? I asked. Because I agree with Chairman Mao. The Ministry of Culture is full of emperors and generals, beautiful ladies and gifted scholars. Our institute had been a castle for musicians who care about works only a small number of people can understand. It shouldn't belong only to a small number of people, but to the worker, peasant, and soldier masses. He looked at me with excitement and conviction. There is a role for everyone to play. Young and old, in every corner of China. You're lucky that you're doing so much to help while you're still so young. When you remember this, when you're all grown up, you'll realize how very glorious it all is. After that conversation, Peng Ming brought me to meetings and let me help with propaganda work. But the first time I had real responsibility was the day of the meeting to criticize the pianist Liu Shikun. They were holding him in Peng Ming's room prior to the meeting, and I was allowed to stand guard. I was very proud. I had a big green army-style coat and a greenish hat that looked almost like a real soldier's cap. They gave me a big, stout stick to use as a weapon. He was already sitting in the room, head bowed, looking far from being a great musician. He had a horse's thin, white face and hard, angry hair, and he was pushing the cloth ties of his blue cotton fur jacket open and closed nervously with his long, white fingers. He looked up when I came in, but immediately bowed his head again, while I marched proudly over to the window, and I stood with my hands at my waist, guarding him fiercely. The window opened on the squad, where the criticism meeting was already in session. Down with Liu Shikun echoed clearly from below, and then there was relative silence as the speeches began. Liu Shikun looked up and inclined his head slightly as if to listen, but I immediately barked, "Don't move," and he returned to his original position. After a while, he licked his lips and half whispered, "Please give me some water. I'm thirsty." I did not know what to do. A revolutionary shouldn't give water to his enemy, but I couldn't just stand there with water in the thermos only a few feet away. But what if someone saw me? I went to the doorway to listen to see if there was anyone coming, and then I quickly poured a cup from the thermos. But the water was too hot, and Liu Shikun could barely sip it. I was afraid someone would come, so I took another cup and scooped up some cold water that had been used for washing dishes and poured a little of that into Liu Shikun's cup. As he drank it down, I said fiercely, "You can't tell anyone about this, or next time I won't give you anything at all." After a while, he looked at me and asked, "How old are you?" "You must be only a bit over 10. My pride was offended. I pointed to my red armband. "What's this? A 10-year-old can't be a red guard." Liu Shikun only said softly, "You're too young to know better," and was silent. Then the sound of slogans started up again, and the stairs ran with footsteps. 4 strong red guards threw the door open and barked, "Liu Shikun, let's go." They were carrying a heavy iron placard and a big paper that labeled "Counter-Revolutionary Musician Liu Shikun." He stood up, bowing nervously as they placed these roughly on him and shoved him out the door. I started to follow, but realized I had forgotten to lock the door and went back. Then I had a queer thought. Perhaps later he would be thirsty, so I poured out a glass of clean hot water and let it sit there to cool. Then I went out to join the meeting. The crowd was throwing stones and spitting. Liu Shikun had been placed on a platform for interrogation. "Are you a counter-revolutionary musician?" Someone kicked him onto the floor and made him kneel. I am. "Did you play stinking revisionist music in the Soviet Union's World Youth Piano Competition? Did you win a prize? Did you shake hands with Khrushchev? Did you smile and surrender to the Soviet revisionist? Did you?" It seemed as if he were trying to remember something. Someone kicked him again. "Speak, quickly." Yes, I surrendered. Then someone led the crowd in a chant. "Down with the Soviet revisionist spy. Down with Liu Shikun." Next, they sang the special song they had made up for the occasion. "Liu Shikun, you bastard. Now you can surrender. If you do not tell the truth, you may quickly die." Everyone was excited, and I sang with all my heart. It was cold, and the dust was blowing. The speeches were long and inspiring. Some said Liu Shikun was an individualist, that he had tried to become famous. Others that he had lived a capitalist lifestyle and hoarded money under his pillow. Then, at last, it was time to conclude the meeting with the collective study of the sayings of Chairman Mao. According to the custom, the worst counter-revolutionaries had no right to listen to the sayings of Chairman Mao. There ensued a rather lengthy discussion to ascertain which, if any, of the 10 odd counter-revolutionaries present could stay. Only 2 of the musicians and composers were determined worthy, and the rest were led away. I went to unlock the door for Liu Shikun. When everyone else had left, I handed him the cup of water before he had a chance to ask for it. After he had drunk it down, he asked to be taken to the bathroom. He trembled all over as he walked, and his urine was a queer dark yellow. I felt funny as I led him back, thinking about how father was criticized, but I tried to push my thoughts away. When they came to take him away, he thanked me in a soft, weary voice. Later, whenever I saw him sweeping the floors and cleaning the toilets, I felt embarrassed and tried to avoid him. It was almost as if there was something personal between us. If there was any single thing that meant ecstasy to everyone in those days, it was seeing Chairman Mao. Ever since I had been in Peking, the possibility had been in the back of my mind, and like every other Red Guard, I would have laid down my life for the chance. Liang Feng's Red Guard detachment had come to Peking and been reviewed a few months earlier, and I remembered her description well. They stayed at hospitality stations run by the PLA, and the soldiers trained them especially in preparation for the great day. They learned how to march in formation, how to stand at attention. They prepared their cleanest clothes and traded revolutionary paraphernalia madly among themselves in an effort to give the largest possible Chairman Mao buttons. When the day came, everyone took out their little red books, their canteens, and folders full of postcards imprinted with slogans from Chairman Mao and their organization's names to trade with members of other Red Guard groups from different parts of the country. Everyone knew Chairman Mao always showed up in the morning at 10, but by 5, Tiananmen Square was a human sea of red and green. There were big red billboards, red balloons, red armbands, red flags, red placards, red books, and red buttons. And their clothing was PLA green, either real or the closest imitation. While we're waiting there were singing competitions among the various groups, each one trying to demonstrate greater love of Chairman Mao and greater revolutionary ardor. Despite the fact that there were no bathrooms and that it was so crowded that some Red Guards fainted, everyone agreed that it was their happiest day on earth. By the time I reached Peking, Chairman Mao had already reviewed the Red Guards specifically more than 8 times, and those glorious days of particular notice were over. However, everyone knew that on May 1st, International Workers' Day, and on October 1st, National Day, the leaders of China would go to the Gate Tower to watch the fireworks. Therefore, as May 1st approached, everyone's mind and conversation were on one thing only. Would Chairman Mao watch the celebration, and would we have a chance to see him? Of course, nothing was certain, but I did not know a single person who wasn't going to the Tiananmen Square to find out. Since the Central Institute of Music was, after all, a performance unit, its Red Guards gravitated naturally towards propaganda work. On May 1st, Peng Ming was planning to go with a small group to conduct performances of revolutionary songs at the Summer Palace during the day and then go in the evening to the square. By this time, I had been taught some of the simple dances like the loyalty dance for Chairman Mao, and I was sometimes asked to carry drums and other instruments, so I went with Peng Ming's group to the park, where we completely unprepared for what happened. In the middle of a singing of a song that Peng Ming had composed himself, we heard the great news. Chairman Mao was in the park. Gathering our instruments together hastily, we ran gasping to the spot, but it was too late. He was gone. All that remained of him was the touch of his hand on the hands of a few who had been lucky enough to get close to him. But we did not leave in disappointment. That trace of precious warmth in the palms of others seemed to us a more than adequate substitute for the real thing. Those Chairman Mao had touched now become the focus of our fervor. Everyone surged towards them with outstretched arms in hopes of transferring the sacred touch to their own hands. If you could not get close enough for that, then shaking the hand of someone who had shaken hands with our great saving star would have to do. And so it went down the line until sometimes handshakes were removed as much as 100 times from the original one, spreading outward in a vast circle like waves in a lake when a meteor crashes into its center. The joy of touching the hand that had touched the hand that had touched the hand was indescribable, and there were tears in my eyes when I received the gift and turned, shouting to Peng Ming, "Shake it, shake my hand." He grasped my hand passionately in his, nearly weeping. "I'm happy. I'm so happy." The handshake didn't end there. All 14 of us piled back into the truck and banged on our drums and cymbals all the way down to the Central Institute of Music, shouting out the news as we drove through the gate. Soon, much of the institute had turned out to join in the handshaking. I must have stood there pumping for more than an hour, as the loudspeakers blared out what had happened and played triumphal music. I don't think it occurred to anyone that none of us had been anywhere near the man. Of course, after this we wanted to see Chairman Mao even more, and our hopes for the evening were high. Finally, it was time to go. We brought our instruments, for we would go from one group to another, accompanying them and leading them in song. Everything was as Liang had said, except that it was night. There were tens of thousands of black heads facing the gatehouse. With the exception of propaganda teams like our own, everyone was seated in revolutionary regiments, singing the slogan songs. chanting, "We want to see Chairman Mao." There were frequent rumors that the chairman had arrived, and then everyone would break rank and rush forward in a giant wave, while the soldiers shouted, "Keep revolutionary order, go back to your places and sit down." By 9, he still hadn't arrived. Then the loudspeakers began to play "The East is Red," and everyone rushed in a great swell towards the bridge, for this time they were sure he was actually coming. Because of our relative mobility, at that moment we had the misfortune to be at the very rear of the crowd. We were rushing desperately forward, craning our necks to see, when suddenly a line of soldiers ran up behind us and made a passage right through our group. It seemed Chairman Mao had not been the gate tower after all, but in the great hall of the people behind us, on the opposite side of the square. Now a line of cars was making its way towards us, and I had the front row view. Chairman Mao's car was first, a Peking brand army jeep. As in a dream, I saw him. He seemed very tall to me, magnificent, truly larger than life. He waved his hat as the jeep drove slowly through the throng. The soldiers forming the passageway stood at attention, but the tears poured down their faces in rivulets. Nevertheless, they managed to sniffle their refrain. "Please keep revolutionary order. Please keep revolutionary order." I was bawling like a baby, crying out incoherently again and again. "You are our heart's reddest sun." My tears blocked my vision, but I could do nothing to control myself. Then Chairman Mao's car was passed, and Premier Zhou's followed. The people in front hadn't realized what had happened and were still chanting, "We want to see Chairman Mao," with their backs turned to all the action. As they discovered him in their midst, however, they nearly mopped the car, obstructing its passage completely. The chairman actually got out then and shook hands with as many people as he could. It was only when the crowd was told that the chairman wanted to climb the gate tower to see the fireworks that they separated and let the car go through. All the lights in the gate tower were lit. You could see the silhouettes of everyone inside, although it was hard to tell which one was his. The loudspeakers were still playing "The East is Red," and the fireworks were more splendid than any one I have ever seen. They went on steadily for half an hour, a succession of the most dazzling lights the land that invented fireworks had to offer. There were showers of silver daggers, cataracts of vermilion foam, and with every burst, the hearts of tens of thousands of young people working for the salvation of China opened with reverence for the blessing they had been shown. There were 2 final miracles: a revolutionary red rocket, which burst into the words, "Long live our great leader Chairman Mao," and a purple one, which read, "Long live the great Communist Party." When it was all over, everyone ran to the post office to telegraph the good news to their families all over China. I waited more than 2 hours to trace out the trembling words. This evening at 9:15, I became the happiest person in the world. I knew my father would need no further explanation. We were awake all night talking about our deep joy. We remembered every detail of what he had looked like or done, although no one could have seen clearly in the darkness. People were still talking the next day, hurrying to buy the newspapers to see if their friends were in the pictures. And leaders like Peng Ming looked to see which Red Guard groups were mentioned by name to see if there were any new clues about who was in favor. A couple of days later, I got a letter from my father who said he missed me and wanted me to come home. My heart was heavy, but since everyone said that Chairman Mao wouldn't be making any more public appearances, and since I had been away for close to half a year, I knew it was time for me to go. Peng Ming's sister, who had reached Peking too late for the great event, and in her disappointment decided to return to Changsha, offered to take me with her. Before we left, we went to the Gold Water Bridge and scooped up some of that happiness water and put it in our canteens. Then we scraped up little piles of dirt and put them in envelopes. Finally, I took out a clean piece of white paper, pressed my hand firmly against the chalky red wall of the square, and fixed my red handpin to the white paper forever. These mementos were to be my greatest treasures in the years to come, my solace in times of trouble, and the envy of all my friends. I had been free in Peking and had achieved everything I had ever dreamed of when the Cultural Revolution had first begun. Now I was returning to that old arena of hurts and troubles. I hoped that the situation in Changsha would be as confused as in Beijing, and that the rebels and conservatives would be too busy struggling among themselves to pay much attention to my family. Still, I had very mixed feelings about going back. It was especially hard to say goodbye to Peng Ming, my protector and teacher. He assured me over and over that he would write to me, but even my revolutionary will could not control my tears as he grasped my shoulders in a final farewell. Little Peng and I had to jump a freight train from the suburb of Fengtai to get home since there were no longer any free tickets. We ended up in an open logging car, more fortunate than some of the other Red Guards who had to ride on piles of black coal. It was bitterly cold and the wind hurt, so most of us huddled together at the bottom of the car and at the front of the logs. Suddenly, a girl perched up on top cried out, "Look! Look! How terrible!" We stood up and saw in the coal cart ahead, barely 12 feet away, a male Red Guard raping a female Red Guard, while another boy sat on her upper body and held her arms down. I did not really understand what was happening. I could see she was struggling and crying out, her face all twisted, but her cries were faint in the wind. My friends screamed, "Stop it! Stop it!" But if her attackers hurt them, they must have known there was no way to cross over from car to car. They switched places right in front of us, and the second boy forced her legs apart. Little Peng and her friends were weeping, with what I later understood to be horror, fury, and shame. But the attackers were as indifferent as if we weren't there. The girl was black with coal dust and seemed to be getting weaker. Not long after the second boy finished, we pulled into a station. The boys ran away before my companions could think what to do, while the girl crawled out and fell onto the platform, weeping soundlessly. We climbed out and went to her. We were completely unequipped to deal with such things and had no idea what in such situations the victim should be taken to a doctor. Ignorance is the only excuse for what we did for her, which was nothing. My companions asked her name over and over, asked who the boys were, asked where she was going. She just lay there, moaning miserably. When the train whistle sounded, my friends seemed torn between their desire to do something and their desire to catch the train. I suppose it was their inability to think of a way to help that pushed the balance in favor of selfishness. And we left her. I don't think there was a single one of them who didn't feel guilty, though. As we pulled out of the station, Little Peng said the girl would never have the face to go home again and would probably kill herself. A boy said over and over again, they could not be real Red Guards. We hardly spoke at all the rest of the way to Changsha. This incident made such a deep impression on me that it changed me in some fundamental way. I became much more aware of others in trouble, as if always trying to atone for that first failure to help.